I am nothing but a bloody amoeba. Prince Philip's most famous complaint was not preserved as audio. It survives in royal biographies as something sharper, the shape of a humiliation he believed was real. He had given up foreign titles, become British, taken the surname Mountbatten, married the future queen, and then found that his own children would not carry the name he had chosen for himself. In an ordinary family, that might have stayed private, but in 1952 the name crossed the palace gates. It became a question for ministers, courtiers, and the machinery of the state. Windsor was not just palace stationery. It was a dynastic shield, guarded by people who feared what a change might suggest. A crossed-out name, cabinet pressure, an official declaration. That is how one husband's family pride became constitutional business. To see why that crossed-out name mattered, we have to split the problem in two. A royal house name is the public label of a dynasty, the banner under which a monarch reigns. Windsor was that banner. It carried continuity from George V through George VI to Elizabeth II. A personal surname is different. It is the name someone might use on a register, a certificate, or in ordinary family life. Charles and Anne were not nameless. They were prince and princess, descendants of the sovereign, members of the House of Windsor. Philip's wound sat lower down the tree. When a family name was needed, would his children carry Mountbatten, the name he had adopted as his British identity? If this had only been a household choice, Philip's expectation might have carried enormous weight. But in 1952, the name of the reigning family was treated as a constitutional signal. Buckingham Palace, Westminster, and Downing Street all had a stake in what the public would hear. The paper trail runs through three pressure points: Philip's attachment to Mountbatten, the old establishment's defense of Windsor, and the cabinet advice that narrowed the Queen's freedom until a family decision became an act of state. Only then does Philip's anger make sense, not as a tantrum over a word, but as the moment he discovered that inside the monarchy, even a father's name could be overruled by the crown above him. Before Windsor could overrule Mountbatten, Philip first had to become Mountbatten. Philip did not arrive at Elizabeth's side as a settled English aristocrat with an uncomplicated identity. He was born Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark into a royal world spread across Europe. But by the time he married the future queen, he had remade his public life around Britain. The clearest proof of that remaking was the Navy. Philip served as a British naval officer during the Second World War, building a career in uniform rather than simply waiting for a palace role. The photographs from that period matter. A young prince beside a princess, but also a lieutenant in naval blue, attached to ships, commands, routines, and a service culture where name and rank shaped how a man stood in the world. Then came 1947. Before his marriage to Princess Elizabeth, Philip became a British subject. He renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles. He also adopted the surname Mountbatten, the anglicized family name connected to his mother's side and already familiar in Britain through his uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten. So Mountbatten was not a spare label pulled into a later marital argument. It marked a deliberate exchange. Foreign titles set aside, British nationality taken up, a naval career folded into service beside the heir to the throne. Marriage required another adjustment. Philip entered Westminster Abbey as a decorated officer and a born prince, but he also entered an institution larger than him. Elizabeth was not merely his wife. She was the king's daughter, and the monarchy's future ran through her. Still, in late 1940s Britain, ordinary expectation pointed one way. A husband's surname usually passed to the children. When Prince Charles was born in 1948 and Princess Anne in 1950, Philip had every reason to believe Mountbatten would have a place in his family's public identity. For a few years, that expectation could remain suspended because Elizabeth was still Princess Elizabeth. Then George VI died. Elizabeth became queen, and the surname Philip had built his new identity around collided with Windsor, a name the monarchy had created under pressure and now guarded as a shield. The collision did not begin in 1952. It began with Windsor itself. Windsor was not an ancient family name handed down through centuries of calm succession. It was created in 1917, during the First World War, when King George V faced a brutal political problem. The British royal family's dynastic name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, sounded unmistakably German while Britain was fighting Germany. The answer was blunt. The royal house would no longer carry that German name. It would become Windsor, borrowing from the castle, solid, English, medieval in feeling, and already wrapped in royal imagery. That change was survival politics. A dynasty with European bloodlines had to present itself as visibly British. Windsor became public armor, easy to say, hard to attack, and useful whenever the monarchy needed to look rooted rather than foreign. By 1952, that memory still lived inside the older royal establishment. Britain had just come through a second war against Germany. Bomb sites still marked London. Rationing had not fully disappeared. For courtiers and politicians formed by two wars, names were not harmless labels. They could carry associations, anxieties, and headlines. Mountbatten, though perfectly British in Philip's life by then, had its own complicated history. It was the anglicized form of Battenberg, another German-linked family name changed during the pressures of 1917. To Philip, Mountbatten represented the identity he had chosen when he became a British subject. To Windsor loyalists, it could look like reopening the very problem the monarchy had tried to close. Queen Mary, George V's widow and Elizabeth's grandmother, embodied that institutional memory. She had lived through the original name change, understood what Windsor had cost, and regarded the dynasty's public identity as something to be guarded. So when Elizabeth became queen, the argument over her children's name entered a room already crowded with history. Mountbatten was Philip's claim to family continuity. Windsor was the crown's shield. In February 1952, those meanings met under intense pressure. A dead king, a young queen, and a reign that had to define itself immediately. In February 1952, privacy ran out. George VI died on the 6th of February, while Elizabeth was in Kenya. In a single day, she ceased to be the heir and became the sovereign. The woman who had been Philip's wife and the mother of Charles and Anne was now Queen Elizabeth II. That change altered the weight of every family decision around her. What might have been settled as a household matter, what name the children would carry, what name the dynasty might be known by, now touched the public identity of a new reign. For Philip, the expectation still had simple emotional logic. He had become Mountbatten. He had married the future queen. His children, in ordinary family terms, would carry his name. But monarchy does not treat ordinary family terms as ordinary. Then came the reported boast that sharpened the Windsor defense. Several later accounts describe Lord Louis Mountbatten, Philip's powerful and ambitious uncle, speaking as if a new era had arrived for the Mountbatten name. The most famous version has him boasting that the House of Mountbatten now reigned. That line has to be handled carefully. It is not the same kind of evidence as a proclamation or a cabinet minute. It belongs to memoirs, diaries, and biographical recollection, where wording and impact can shift depending on who tells the story. Even so, it helps explain the reaction. To Queen Mary and others shaped by the 1917 crisis, the danger was not only Philip's personal surname. It was the appearance that Windsor, the name built to protect the crown, might be quietly replaced by a name attached to Philip's uncle, his ambitions, and a complicated continental family past. So the question hardened. Not only what will Philip's children be called, But what name will define the reign that begins now? From there, the argument could not stay behind palace doors. The alarm moved toward the people who could turn preference into policy: the prime minister, the cabinet, and the official machinery of the state. Now the story leaves recollection and enters the files. Cabinet Office papers from 1952 show that Churchill's government did not treat the name as a small domestic preference. The advice moving through the official system was that the royal name should remain Windsor. Not because Philip was accused of wrongdoing, and not because Mountbatten was forbidden, but because ministers and palace elders saw Windsor as part of the crown's public architecture, a name created under pressure in 1917, tested through war, and now attached to the legitimacy of a new reign. That was the moment Philip's expectation became vulnerable. In an ordinary family, the question might have ended at the nursery door. In this family, it passed through Downing Street. The decisive public act came in April 1952. Queen Elizabeth II declared that she and her children and her descendants would bear the name Windsor. The royal house would not become Mountbatten. The line on the family tree stayed where the old establishment wanted it, under the label built by George V. For Elizabeth, the proclamation carried the weight of constitutional advice. For Philip, it landed as something personal. The name he had adopted when he became British, the name he expected to give his children, had been overruled by a process in which he had no real authority. This is the hinge of the dispute, not a whispered insult, not a private marital verdict, but a government-backed decision, made formal by the Queen, that turned Windsor from preference into policy, and left Philip standing just outside the path of power. This is where the simple blame story begins to crack. On paper, she was the sovereign. Her name sat at the top of the proclamation, her voice made the decision official. But a constitutional monarch does not move through a crisis as a private person with total freedom. In 1952, Elizabeth was 25, newly crowned, grieving her father, and being advised by a government and palace establishment determined to protect Windsor. So the neat version, that a wife simply refused her husband, leaves out the machinery around her. Cabinet advice, Queen Mary's dynastic caution, Churchill's political instincts, and the memory of fragile royal legitimacy all pressed toward the same point. Keep Windsor, and do not let the reign begin under a different family label. That does not soften Philip's humiliation. It sharpens the trap. From his side, the result was brutally visible. He was Duke of Edinburgh, consort to the Queen, father of the heir, a decorated naval officer, and still he had no decisive say over the name attached to his own children's place in history. The family tree included him, but the public label passed around him. That is why the famous complaint attributed to him had such force, that he was the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his children. It was not a legal analysis. It was a cry of status in an age when a father's surname carried heavy social meaning. The constitutional decision solved the monarchy's problem. It preserved continuity, calmed institutional nerves, and kept the crown under Windsor. Inside the household, it left something unresolved. For the rest of the 1950s, Mountbatten did not disappear. It stayed like a muted branch on the royal family tree, connected, visible, but not allowed to define the house. As Elizabeth and Philip's family grew, that unresolved line stretched toward the next official moment when the name question could no longer be avoided. The next opening was not a private apology. It was another document. By 1960, Elizabeth and Philip were expecting their third child. Charles and Anne had been born before the accession, but this baby would arrive inside a reign already defined by the Windsor decision. The old question returned with sharper edges. If the Queen had more descendants, where could Philip's name live? On February 8, 1960, the answer entered official language. At a meeting of the Privy Council, the Queen declared that her descendants who were not styled Royal Highness and who did not hold the title of Prince or Princess would bear the surname Mountbatten-Windsor. The exact wording mattered. It did not rename the dynasty. It did not turn the House of Windsor into the House of Mountbatten-Windsor. The crown label at the top of the family tree stayed exactly where the 1952 proclamation had fixed it: Windsor. But lower down the tree, on the personal surname branch, Philip's chosen name was finally allowed to appear beside the Queen's. Mountbatten was no longer merely the muted name of the consort standing outside the line of authority. It had a defined official place. So the compromise was real, but limited. It acknowledged the grievance without undoing the decision that created it. Philip gained a share in the family name of certain descendants. The institution kept the public dynasty untouched. In that double label, Windsor above, Mountbatten-Windsor below, the whole story becomes visible. A family name admitted only after it had been contained. The double label is the landing point. In 1947, Mountbatten was the name Philip chose as he remade himself for a British life. A new nationality, a naval career, and a marriage into a family that was also an institution. In 1952, Windsor was the name the Crown protected. Cabinet advice, palace pressure, and the memory of why Windsor had been created turned a family preference into a matter of constitutional obedience. In 1960, Mountbatten-Windsor became the compromise, not the name of the royal house, but a permitted surname for descendants below a carefully drawn line. By then, the quarrel was clearly larger than a word. A surname carried identity. Windsor carried legitimacy. The Queen's decision preserved continuity, but it also showed how little private freedom remained once a family name touched the crown. Philip was not simply overruled by his wife. He was overruled by the machinery surrounding the crown. The monarchy survived because Windsor stayed untouched. Philip's name survived because it was admitted in limited form. And the cost survived too, visible in the gap between the public dynasty and the private family beneath it. In royal history, betrayal does not always arrive as a shout behind palace doors. Sometimes it arrives as advice, minutes, and a proclamation. A piece of paper closes, a gate shuts. One name remains above the line, while another is allowed to live below it.